Thank you. I would like to now turn it over to Joseph. One of the things that I asked him is to tell us a little bit about himself, because he moved from film studies to law and now to making these types of documentaries. So he seems to have a lot of different types of interests. And so I hope he can introduce himself better to you guys.
Aloha. Hello, everyone. I'm Joseph, as was introduced. I'm the director of Chosen, and prior, another documentary titled Jeronimo, which is about Koreans in Cuba. I just flew in from New York a couple days ago, and sorry for veering off a little bit to share too much of a personal story, but I am recently engaged last month, and I decided to take this opportunity to come with my fiance. Fiance, would you like to stand up? And so this will serve as our early moon, in fact. So really happy to be here and really honored to be invited by the University of Hawaii. And thank you so much, Professor Peck and Chris, for your work. So as was alluded to during the introduction, I did study film studies at UC San Diego, but like any other good aspiring storyteller, I decided to go to law school and became a practicing lawyer for 4 years. And sometime in at the end of 2015, I decided to go to Cuba on a backpacking trip because I just wanted to reward myself. It was at the end of the year. And so I backpacked to Cuba thinking that I'll drink a lot of rum, smoke cigars, and listen to Cuban jazz and whatnot. Unbeknownst to me, walking out of the airport and hopping into a taxi, I turned around and the first Cuban I met in Cuba was this middle-aged Asian lady, right? I was surprised and I asked her, "Are you Chinese?" Because probability-wise, there's more Chinese than Koreans in the world, right? And she turns around and she says, "No, I'm a fourth-generation Korean Cuban. My grandpa was sold as an indentured servant to Yucatan, Mexico 100 years ago. And my father was born and raised in Cuba, fought in the Cuban Revolution with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. And he ended up becoming a vice minister in Cuba." Next day, she invited me over to her house, and I got to meet all her family members. And I was so profoundly moved by that experience. Just a complete sheer chance encounter, and discovering this part of Korean diaspora that I had never known existed really transformed my life. Initially, I thought I would be going back to Cuba once again with my film crew, film friends, to make a 20-minute YouTube clip. But little did I know that turned into a 3-year journey where I ended up going back to Cuba 5 more times. I quit my law practicing initially just for 1 year, but I never returned to practicing law. So it came my first documentary, Jeronimo. I just want to point out, though, that the genesis of Korean immigration to Cuba actually shares its roots with Koreans that came to Hawaii, starting from 1903 to 1905. I might add that I don't know how many ships ended up coming over to Hawaii from Incheon. Was it 70 plus? Something like that, from my recollection. Only one ship out of the 70 departing from Chemulpo, Incheon actually went to Yucatan, right? Mexico, some of whom ended up migrating to Cuba 16 years later in 1921. So in a way, in a really weird way, had it not been for Korean migration to Hawaii, there would have never been an immigration to Mexico, and I would have never run into Korean descendants from Cuba and Mexico 7 years ago. That changed my life. So there's this weird connection, existential connection. So maybe I'll leave with that. Maybe I'll just add how I came to make Chosen. I swore to myself when I was making Jeronimo that this will be my first and last film because filmmaking, especially documentary filmmaking with little means is just too hard, right? But when I wrapped making Jeronimo and it opened in theaters in Korea, I was ready to go back to practicing law, but the pandemic hit and I was relegated to my parents' home in Korea. And I was starting having soul searching as to what to do. This was back in 2020, around March. I read John Bolton's expose memoir. It's titled The Rumor It Happened, where John Bolton, the former security advisor to Trump, talks about his 2 years of experience in the White House working with Trump. One of the chapters in that book is titled Hanoi, right? In reference to the peace summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. John Bolton basically talks about why the Hanoi peace summit failed. And he gives 3 reasons at large. 1, self-interest between Trump, Pompeo, and Bolton, their ideological differences, and impulsive decision by those 3 individuals. That's why the Korean peace talks failed. That's basically what he said. I'm sure the elements are much more complex, but at least that's how he summarized it. When I was reading those lines, I thought to myself, wow, the fate of an entire country, the history of an entire region, literally hinges upon the decision of 3 old, uninformed, white US politicians. And I thought to myself, what if those positions were occupied by Korean Americans, or they had staff or aide who were of Korean descent who had more personal relationship to the region? Maybe the history or the fate of the Korean Peninsula could have been changed. That's around the time when I read newspaper saying that there are 5 Korean Americans running for US House. And I thought to myself, maybe I should start following them. That's the genesis of how Chosen, the idea started. Yeah.
Thank you. Perhaps you could explain to us how you came up with the name Chosun.
Yeah. So if you were to have played the film in full until the ending credit, the last ending credit rolled up, one of the last lines that I show is a historical fact. In 1882, U.S. Forms a treaty with then Korea, right? Then Chosun. In other words, the first legal official document that U.S. signed with Chosun, they spell Chosun the kingdom of chosen, the way it's spelled in the movie, CHOSEN. So last year was a 140-year sort of anniversary. It's a little pun intended. So in reference to Chosun, and also for those of you who speak Korean, the term Chosun actually means literally first time elected, Chosun 의원, and chosen as in you're elected, you're selected, you're accepted. So I had those 3 implications, and I might add that there's sort of this Christian implication too, in the sense that, it just happens that David Kim is the only one unchosen in the sense of electoral politics, but I just wanted to sort of signify that even if you are, you feel like you're abandoned by your family and the community, in a way, you are a chosen person too. So that's sort of a hidden, unofficial 4th meaning. Yeah.
All right, good. Thank you. I guess we can open up the floor for questions, but I want to start though. I do have a question, because this is actually the 2nd time that I've seen this video. So did I understand it correctly that Michelle Park Steele didn't really like David Kim very much?
Is this on record?
I don't think it's being recorded.
It's hard to say. I mean, after all, she's a politician. Everyone's diplomatic on camera. I don't think she had necessarily a personal hostility or animosity towards David. It's just that, Michelle Steele Park's perspective on David actually reflects the attitude that the Korean American community had towards David during the election period, which is, who is this kid? We've never heard of you. We've never seen you in Korean community. You come out of the blue and think you can represent the Korean community, right? And I think that's what she was implying throughout several interviews, is that, this is a serious game. This is adults' game, right? And all the other four, other than David Kim, had some sort of credentials, right? They were former California assemblywoman. In the case of Andy Kim, he used to work for State Department. Marilyn Strickland was the mayor of Tacoma, but David Kim didn't have any public service credentials. So I think that's where she came from. Yeah.
I kind of got that impression as well. But we can open up the floor for questions. Harrison?
We'll come to you afterwards. Yeah, that's okay.
Let me reiterate Harrison's thanks. It was a very entertaining, thoughtful afternoon. Real quick question. I didn't follow the election in 2022 on the mainland. What happened?
Yeah, I was thinking this might be the first question that comes up. David ended up running again in 2022. Unless you Google during the break time. Can I hear a drum roll or something? So all the same five candidates that's featured and chosen ended up running. Everyone won except for David. And David lost this time only by a mere 3,000 votes, by just over 2 percentage points, which is a great improvement from last election because he lost by 6%. So, and the other four ended up becoming re-elected. So unfortunately, David didn't make it the second time. I think he is deliberating whether he should run for the third, but he's still young, he has chance, but he dedicated 4 years of his youth sort of life running for campaign, both of which he didn't succeeded. So it remains to be seen. Yeah.
I think it's intimate enough that don't have to use a microphone. However, I did have a filmmaker question. My first question was going to be about getting access to your subjects. I know that's fairly difficult, especially when you want to get into the personal lives. But was there any requests for editorial control over the final product by any of your subjects?
No, there's no either direct or indirect request from any of the subjects. In fact, I know 3 people have watched the film, but the other 2 candidates have yet to watch. David Kim, I believe Marilyn Strickland, and Young Kim have watched the film. The other 2, I haven't heard from them directly as to what their feedback was. I'll take the liberty to answer a slightly more personal and perhaps sensitive elements of the film, which is my relationship to David's parents and how they have reacted after watching the film. I can talk about this for hours, but so before calling the quits with the film's final outcome, I asked David and his brother Evan. I gave them an ultimatum as to the role that their parents play in the film, because although I try to humanize David's parents and try to pay my personal respect for their legacy, ministerial legacy, the truth be told, the film could damage their reputation. I was very well aware of that. I was keen to that concern. I asked David and David's brother whether they want the segments where they talk about domestic violence or their outright disapproval of David's sexuality in the film. Both of their answers were adamant yes, they really wanted those portions, because without which they didn't think it does justice to David's full arc of personal journey. And his fear for coming out to the Korean community wouldn't have been explained without those portions. And I honored their requests and included those parts, which obviously weren't well received by the parents when they watched the film. So my initial relationship to David's parents in the months after the first release of Chosen in the US has been rocky. Now they've come to terms with, the realistic portrayal of what is, and now they came to terms with the film now. But I must admit, and this is my confession, that it's been very tough sort of treading that sensitive water between the family dynamics. And whatever the consequences, I have to bear that responsibility of living with it.
So do you receive 30 or 40 texts a day from David's father?
Without wanting to further, damage David's parents' legacy, I did. I did for, on different weeks, I would get several voice messages, which was, borderline sort of outright disapproval, to say the least. But now they're okay. Yeah, Professor.
Thanks so much for your wonderful presentation in addition to this documentary watching. I have a interesting question to me because as a lawyer and a law professor, I know David Kim, after running for this candidacy, he went back to lawyer's work. On the other hand, you, as a lawyer, working as a, practicing, you decided to become a filmmaker. And I'm constantly asking myself, why are you making this? And is this life as a filmmaker better than your life as a lawyer? And what is your goal as a 1.5 generation Korean American in doing this?
Is my life better as a filmmaker than lawyer? Financially, definitely not. But any areas other than economical stability, absolutely. I get to travel to Hawaii and share the film with strangers, get connected with students and so forth. And I learn a lot. But jokings aside, I think why I do this, I really happen to believe in the stories of Korean diaspora. Diasporic consciousness, I think it's very important because I don't know how deeply I want to go into the subject matter, but there's a professor I really respect, Kang Nam-sun, who's a theologian and a philosopher. She says there are two types of diaspora, conscious diaspora and unconscious diaspora. Just because you happen to live outside of their homeland doesn't make you possess diasporic consciousness. It's something that you have to be enlightened with, educated with, right? And by diaspora, she says, it's the Samaritan, it's the Good Samaritan. Why do you think the Good Samaritan was the only person who stopped to help an a wounded stranger when the Levites and the Pharisee, who were the mainstream Jewish people who were chosen at the time, passed by this stranger? Because Samaritan understood as someone who's living as a minority, as a foreigner, as a diaspora, the concerns of other vulnerable, marginalized people, right? And the reason that Jesus tells that story of Good Samaritan, and I'm not being religious, I'm just referencing, a Judeo-Christian sort of philosophical bedrock. Jesus talked about Good Samaritan in response to a Pharisee's question, how can we be saved? And Jesus says, you have to be a good neighbor. And the Pharisee says, who's a good neighbor? And Jesus said, Good Samaritan. So Professor Kang Nam-sun goes on to say that diasporic consciousness is at the core center of Christian message. This is how we become saved. And I made Chosen at the height of the Trump sort of rhetoric against other minorities. And it was during the time of COVID, BLM, Asian hate crimes. I mean, I felt like it was a doomsday. And I had to try to make sense of how can we peacefully coexist amidst our differences? What kind of philosophical, moral foundation do we need? And I find that the lives and history and consciousness of diaspora as my solution to making sense of this world. And same applies for Korea. Korea, as proud of they deservingly are about their history and where they are, I felt like the tolerance level and their appreciation for diversity is significantly lacking for where they are economically, culturally. And I think the stories of diaspora, whether it's pachinko, minari, whatever it may be, I think I wanted to highlight the stories of diaspora so that they understand, diversity is not an option. It's that's the only way going forward. Especially for a country that borders 25 million other fellow Koreans who come from same history but have become extremely estranged that they are foreigners. Like how do we learn to coexist with them? And my solution to that also was this diasporic consciousness, hospitality. So that's, I think, my main sort of driver as to why I tell these stories. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for this wonderful documentary. I unfortunately missed half of it, but you mentioned to me it's going to be shown in Boston at the AES, right?
That's correct.
Great. I was wondering if this documentary has been shown in Korea and what the reaction was, and if you plan to show it, if you plan to edit it, or if you're just going to show it in the current version.
So Chosen did show in theaters in Korea on November 3rd of last year, which is only a couple months ago. I don't want to make any excuses as to why Chosen didn't do well in terms of box office, but I must confess that only a couple of days before Chosen opened in theaters, there was a stampede in Itaewon where hundreds of people died. So that week where Chosen was opening was declared to be the mourning period where people didn't go to theaters. And unfortunately, as is the case with other independent films, if we don't perform well in the first week of our opening, second week, all the theaters take it down. So more Hollywood, films can come in. And that's exactly what happened. We were caught in this vicious cycle. So about 4,000 people came to watch the film in theaters. We were expecting very conservatively at least 30,000 people plus, which didn't happen. But having that said, one of the most famous Korean critics, his name is Liner, he selected Chosen the best film of 2022. So now hopefully there continues to be some reverberation of the film. And hopefully it will have a long shelf life so that every election cycle people will be reminded about Chosen. So that's my hope. In terms of potential distribution here in the US, I don't think we have a shot at theatrical distribution. And I take the liberty to mention that you guys know Daniel Dae Kim, the famous Korean American actor who's a Hawaii native, right? He lives here. Through our mutual friend, Daniel Dae Kim got a hold of Chosen about a year ago. He really liked the film so much so that he wanted to represent us as he negotiates with Netflix, Amazon, Disney, So Plus. So when he initially said that, I thought to myself, okay, now I can comfortably live as a documentary director. But to make the long story short, after 4 months of hard negotiation, every deal fell through. So now I'm back to square one, trying to find the right distributor so that the film can be shown on the right platform in the US. But currently, Chosen cannot be shown, is not discoverable anywhere on US platforms, unfortunately. So hence, I'm going to all these different cities and universities to do physical showing, as long as the shelf life lasts. So that's where I'm at right now. Yeah. So reaction in Korea, it was well received by the audience, generally speaking. One of the most common comments that I received was how little they knew of Koreans living in America, right? I think for whatever reason, Koreans still have this ideas of Koreans who went to America as those who are seeking or pursuing American dream, but that's the extent to which they know, right? For instance, when Marilyn Strickland wore hanbok and did a swearing in 2 years ago, she appeared in every major news for maybe 10 seconds. It was just a quick mentioning, but people don't know anything further than that. They don't talk about the painful history, personal history that she embodies, right? Or the existence of quote-unquote military brides and the contribution that they made for not only Korea, but Korean Americans who initially settled through family visiting programs and so forth. So I don't think Koreans are really well aware of the plight of Korean diasporas in general, right? Pachinko I'm really grateful how Pachinko was released, because now they're finally tuning in a little bit and started thinking about those who live outside of Korea. But I think it's absolutely necessary. Yeah.
Yes.
For the video, I think.
I watched your first film, Geronimo, and the second. They both are great in a different ways. Now I'm wondering what would be your next project, if you have.
Let's say prestigious universities like University of Hawaii decides to fund my third film because I don't have a personal funds to make it. But let's say I get to engage in third film. My dream project would be last summer I met this guy named Stephen Yoon Sang-hyuk 박사님, who is a doctor, Korean American doctor, who's been living in North Korea for the past 15 years. But now he's unfortunately out of North Korea because of pandemic, but he's looking for ways to get back in. He's been treating kids with disabilities in North Korea for the past 13 years. He's an officially registered doctor at Pyongyang Medical School. And this is what he told me. And he doesn't come with any political or ideological agenda. He's there to truly sort of serve kids with a vulnerable population. And this is what he told me. He runs a 8 weeks therapy program for kids with disability. And from day one until the last day of the therapy program, he witnesses this a vast restoration of human relationship between the kids and their parents, because they learn about their conditions for the first time officially, right? That human restoration was so remarkable that he ended up running for more than a decade. He always experiences miraculous sort of improvement of their relations. He carried that same therapy program to South Korea, and he witnesses the same restoration of human relationship between the kids and their parents. And this is what he told me. By seeing the restoration of human relationship among the most vulnerable and marginalized, voiceless families in both North and South, I'm witnessing the reunification of Korea in advance. I thought it was extremely powerful. So it is my hope that I document those families, both in South and North Korea, as a way to pay forward potential coming of reunification in the peninsula. That's my dream. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I guess we can have one more question if there is.
Yeah. I do too. Two? What if you guys want to go? Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. Considering the answers to the questions where you answered with that theologian you were inspired by, and the answer talking about the parents, I was wondering what religious background you grew up with any? And if so, did that influence you in this process? Thank you.
Yeah. I grew up in a Protestant sort of evangelical Christian setting. My family, I mean, as is the case for probably so many of Korean Americans for sure, but in Korea, sort of evangelical, almost like a fundamental level of Christian beliefs is quite common among Protestant Christians. So in that regard, I don't think I was an exception or an anomaly. But I grew up in a Christian setting. Right now, like liberation theology, like speaks to me larger, for instance, than just a self-salvation or salvation-led Christianity, if you ask me. And to be a little more specific, I don't know if you know this Christian community called Taizé in southern France. It's an ecumenical Christian monastery community, and I've been there a few times, and my life was transformed in the way I regard God and my faith in God. So that's the sort of religious background that it comes from. But I was speaking to Professor Peck earlier, and I mentioned this sort of a revolutionary pastor who was at the forefront of Korea's democratic movement called Moon Kwan. He's a pastor, Moon Kwan. I admire him dearly, and I think his way of sort of professing his faith in God is in relationship to social change is, I find that to be so cool, for the lack of a better word. Yeah.
Thank you. Harrison?
Yes, thank you. So that part in the movie, Joseph, where some leaders in LA are saying that the Korean American identity was born from the experience of the April '92 riots and the conflict. I somehow didn't buy it, but he was so very convincing. He was convinced himself when he was saying that. Right. Many of us here are from that generation, right. Grew up and experienced the '93 or saw it and remember it. I don't know. What do you think? I mean, does April uprisings really play that big of a role in our identity? I'm questioning it myself. What do you think?
For me, learning of that event was a very significant event in terms of me coping with my split dual identity. I didn't know what to make sense of this idea of Korean American identity until I learned about Saigu, LA riots, uprising, however you want to coin it, because I know it can be sensitive depending on how you look at the history. Some people call it riots and uprising, but I'll call it Saigu, which is a neutral term, I think. For me, it was significant learning of it. I think some scholars and activists go as far as saying that what Saigu was for Korean Americans, or let me backtrack, what Japanese internment camp was for Japanese Americans, Saigu was for Koreans in America. Maybe it's an unfair comparison, but I've heard many people in academia use those two comparisons as a way to say that it was a moment of reckoning. It was an awakening moment for us, where their definition of American dream prior to Saigu was just economic stability, perhaps financial success, sending your kids to good school so they can become doctors and lawyers in mainstream America, without thinking further about what it means to be a responsible American, what it means to run for politics, what it means to collaborate with other ethnic groups to build solidarity about a lot of racial injustice. Koreans never really cared much about those things outside of their own success until Saigu, is what they're saying. And I happen to be a strong proponent of that idea that it was such a turning point as we try to define what Korean American identity is. And I think what's interesting now is a whole generation, 30 years have passed, and there's another sort of moment of reckoning with the anti-Asian hate crimes. I happen to think that this is a weird moment where the idea of Korean American identity is broadening and expanding and sort of merging into this larger Asian American identity, which I think is a fascinating concept too. And just balancing how can we be both Korean American and Asian American would be a challenge going forward. How can we be both? How can we be committed to both ideas, right? And yeah, I'd love you to also share more at the talk afterwards. Yeah.
That's actually an interesting analogy. Japanese internment camps. I wonder if you did comparative analysis that showed that there were more Japanese Americans running for office after that. So, any last questions before we call it a day?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, and I really enjoyed watching your documentary. I love it. I became a big fan of you. Instead of asking a question, I'd like to comment one or two things. So, your documentary gave me a very, very different perspective on how to watch the Korean community as well as American society in general. So, you gave me a lot of the food for think. So really appreciate it. During my weekend, if I chance, I really want to watch again your document and what's the meaning, what really your intentions. So really good. Documentary, I really enjoyed it. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. 감사합니다.
I've got all night. It's okay.
I really, really liked your film. Thank you for making this documentary. I was almost cried to look at the David's story. My question is that what I see in LA and what's happening in Korea, politic-wise, is very divided. What's happening in LA, what's happening in Korea now, seems very what should I say, almost same to me. So this film is very important when you said that we need the narrowed the difference and then increase the tolerance for the difference. So I hope you make more this kind of a documentary. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a quick response to that. First of all, thank you. When Chosen had a world premiere, first time showing in the world at Jeonju International Film Festival last May, one of the people who came to watch this film, his name was 정진호 교수님, was at 포항대. And this is what he said. He said, if you have to define Korea's modern history in 2 words, it would be a battle between the framework of Christianity versus socialism. Christianity versus socialism is what defines Korea's modern history. And he said, unfortunately, the initial bickering between the independence fighters, who are more on the socialist end, and those who are elite Christian background, that trend and that sort of framework of worldview continues to dictate Korea's elections, right? I think a case in point is last year's Korea's election was also this socialist versus conservative framework. America, I happen to believe, is another country just like Korea where that, socialism versus anti-communist sort of bickering continue to exist, and no other country perhaps that battle is more fierce than the 2 countries. And so I think you're completely right that the political rhetoric and landscape of these 2 countries mirror each other. In a way, America is leading and Korea is following by a few years. And so it's been that's why I think it's important that Korean American politicians that come out has a large responsibility not only for their American constituents but also for the future of Korea.
Thank you. Any final questions? All right, why don't we give a warm thank you for Joseph. And once he does finish his third documentary, hopefully we'll be able to invite him again to our audience. Thank you very much, everybody.